Oui.
La musique.
Oui, bien sûr. Ah ouais. C'est trop fort.
Je pense que ça va dans la salle. Mais...
Non, moi ça va, je l'ai en...
Non, je pense que c'est bon.
J'ai encore 2 minutes et 20 secondes. 22 minutes et 20 secondes avant le 17h30.
Mais si on dépasse 10 minutes, c'est pas grave. 10 minutes, en fin de journée, c'est pas...
Bah, je peux commencer, en fait, tu me donnes...
Oui, oui, je regarde, on va y aller. Oui, dove salta?
E lì ti alzati.
Sono gente che sono...
Mais ce que je disais, c'est que j'ai légèrement en avance, donc je ne veux pas quand même faire du zèle.
Nicolò, il est sorti, il m'a demandé quand est-ce que ça recommence, il est 5h30. Excuse-moi, il reste...
Non, non, mais c'est exactement, mais c'est ce que... Par contre, c'est dans 1 minute, c'est dans 1 minute et 25 secondes.
Oui, mais
C'est court.
Ça va peut-être faire 2 minutes parce que tu sais...
Ah oui, voilà, c'est...
Tu me donnes, Thierry, tu me donnes le top de départ.
D'accord, ok.
Voilà, moi je démarre quand tu me le dis.
Écoute, on fait la chose avec la déontologie scientifique, c'est-à-dire on ne commence pas à dire Marco Stroppa est un compositeur.
Non. On commence par ça?
Non.
Ah non, non,
Les
voilà.
gens arrivent nus.
Oui, avec certainement. Par contre, je me permettrai de te remercier pour l'invitation.
Oh, ça, si tu veux.
Ça, toi et Jean-Louis, c'est là.
De la rhétorique obligée, mais...
Ah ben oui, ça.
sincère, non.
Non, mais c'est sincère, voilà, exactement.
C'est ça avec Francesco, c'est tu lui dis on attend une minute, il dit ça. Tu fais le chaman
J'ai besoin d'un chairman? Tu avais dit que non?
Oui, quand même. Il y a un minimum.
Just to announce Marco Stroppa. Marco Stroppa is a composer from Italy, but living you are working in the US and now you are working at Stuttgart. And you want to present some element of modeling, but in composition and in music. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I would like to thank you again personally, and thank you, Terry Paul, for the invitation. Although I'm used to talking and presenting my work in different public situations, it's the first time that I talk to mathematicians. And I'm a little bit stressed because I know that I belong to the minority of non-mathematicians tonight. And therefore, I will try to do my best to show an aspect of my, say, compositional work, which I think can be generalized to the work of many other composers, although with different details, but with the same model. So the first thing I remember when I was a child, a very small child, was that I was different than my two younger brothers, because they were normal children. They liked to play games and football and listen to the pop music of that time, the cantautori in Italian, and so le auteur, compositeur, interprète in French. And I wasn't so much interested in that. I was very curious. I discovered a few long plays of classical music and from my father's little discotheque. And then there was at that time in the radio the so-called filo diffusione, which was a radio connected to the telephone and line, the analog telephone line, and there were two channels, one for say pop music, another for classical music. I was keep listening to this classical music. I was having a lot of interest for that, and actually I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know music. I don't come from a musical family, but it was clear that for me, music was a kind of thought, not a language. I was not the music that I was listening to was not telling me something or telling me a story or something, but it was a way of thinking. I could realize even when I was 3-4 years old that, for example, the thinking of Bach was superior than the thinking of, let's say, Pachelbel or Buxtehude, although they were great thinkers, musical thinkers. So later, actually in the last years, I realized that this feeling that I had when I was a child was the manifestation of what I call the immanent musical thought. In English, I call it sensory thought, but in Italian and French, it sounds better because the word has a richer meaning. So for immanent thought, I mean that the thought is not verbal. So already now that I speak about you, I'm already betraying what it is. That is, I don't think about the sounds, although I will tell you something about the sounds that I'm going to play, but I'm thinking with the sounds. So the sounds are the building block of the thought, not with the sounds. And I would like to insist on the importance of sound in music and not of the notation, because there is a lot of music that is not notated. And tonight we will hear some electronic music that was never notated or notated in a different way that has very far from the musical score, sometimes under the form of a computer program. And because the score for a composer, at least, is a connection of sound potential. When we look at a score, if it is not too complicated or too unusual, we do hear a sound behind the score, as I would suppose when you mathematicians, when you look at a formula or an equation. You see the life behind the equation or the world that is portrayed by the equation. And of course, the score needs an interpretation which may have more or less bigger degrees of flexibility to become a real sound. But I would like to insist about sound tonight, also because tonight after the concert that Jean-Louis and I will present, we will also discuss also about what is a video and what is a video can bring to music. Now, not any sound is music. I think you agree with me. What I'm doing now is sound, but I don't think you are attending a concert at the moment. And if you put an accent on the receiver, I think that the definition of Berio which is more than 40 years old, is very interesting. It's music, whatever you as a listener decide that is music. Or there is another approach where you say everything that the author decides is art or music is as such. So when Duchamp exhibits a shovel bought by a local supermarket, and he goes to the Pompidou Center, the main museum of the Pompidou Center, that shovel, so in Vanga in Italian, is art, although it is just what all of us could have bought, but we are not Duchamp. So for sensible or sensible, I mean something that I found in an interesting book by Jacques Tassin, which is Penser comme un arbre, thinking as a tree. And I say maybe trees don't think, they don't have a brain. And actually he shows that's different. And so I mean not only he is so sensitive, so very emotional. I mean also the sensible in terms of understanding, and especially the commitment of the body as a whole. And this is very important, the relationship and the interplay between the brain and the body when you are a musician. Even when, as a composer, you have definitely more an intellectual approach to music, and unless you are also a performer, but performer and composer are two different, say, tasks. So let me introduce one important concept for any kind of composer, which is the notion of musical event. Now, the event is defined by me, but I think you find the same concept in many other composers as a single object in the composer's imagination, which doesn't mean that the object cannot have elements and that the elements cannot be analyzed as separated from or defining the event. But for the composer, it is a starting point of his way of working. Let me give you an idea, a concrete idea from a work of mine. Here is a sequence of events. I circled the events, and you will see how they sound. Etc. So you see, if it was a music of Beethoven, you would say what is typical of Beethoven is a motif, pa-pa-pa-pam, for example. If it is a music of Mozart, it would be rather the melodic invention, the variation, the infinite variation he manages to do. Every composer has a different notion of event, but every composer starts with some starting point. Although you can analyze the event and decompose it into different parts, but that's from the point of view of the imagination of the composer, that's not important. That can be exchanged, and it's the same thing. It's the same event, the same concept. And you notice that there is something you don't see in the score unless you know how to read these kind of scores, but you hear very well. That is, behind each of the notes, there is a sort of prolongation of sound, which is not natural in the meaning that it is not what you would get from a piano if you did nothing to the piano, if you just played or depressed a pedal. But there is a composed resonance. And actually, you see it very clearly here that behind each attack, all the things here, this is a sonogram, frequency, linear frequency in the y-axis, time in the x-axis, and color is intensity of the spectral intensity, red being louder, black, blue, black being softer. And then that you have always say a tail following each of the attacks, and this tail is the result of the composition of the resonance. Now, if we go back to the notion of musical event, and I pursue it a bit further, I would say that event is what I would call a compositional primitive. I will get back to this concept in a while. Of course, in the composer's imagination, events have properties. They can be organized with their own logic, so it's not something verbal. They can show similarities. Similarities can be grouped into families, and there are different criteria for creating families. For example, here I circle with different colors different events, and I decided, because that's the way I compose it, that event A and event A1 belong to the same family. But I could do something different. I could, here are the arrows, define the events according to more phenomenological properties and say that all the short sounds are one family of event, and then the small sound clouds as another family, and the small melodic motifs as a third family. So in this case, I have other families that emerge from the same, material, from the same sound. What are the right ones? Well, it depends what you want to do. Me, as a composer, I use the first one, and I coherently developed the ideas of the first one. A person as a listener or as an analyst could say, could have a different approach, more perceptual, more cognitive, and would say, okay, now this piece is organized in a different way. Nobody is right. There are two realities that can explain the same acoustic phenomenon. I go back to the idea of compositional primitive. I was very much influenced by a course that I took when I was a student at MIT by Gerald J. Sussman called Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. And he wrote a book, and that was my reading book that really for the course. And you notice that already he says educators, I would say composers, program. And he presented programming as an intellectual activity in its own right, not as the ability to put right parentheses or the semicolon at the end of the statement. Another thing that really influenced, that I found interesting at the beginning of his book is that he makes a quote from Marvin Minsky's Why Programming is Good and so on, that his computer is like a violin. I wouldn't propose to take the computer and try to do like this, but, and it's hard to program a violin. But the intellectual aspect, if you are abstract enough, it is the same kind of, procedure. I would say that, and then in the end, he said that programming belongs to a category called procedural epistemology, that is a structure of knowledge from an imperative point of view. Now, that's exactly what we do as composers. We are imperative people. We write a score, which is a set of commands that an interpreter knows how to decode, and to realize if the person is good enough and if the composer is professional enough, allows you to get back to the composer's original idea, which is what was then before the notation started. I must say that when I was studying programming, for me, writing a fugue or programming was actually the same thing. Writing a fugue was like problem solving. Notating the fugue was like finding a computer language. But the intellectual aspect was absolutely the same. You need to know where to go. You need to analyze the thing. In a fugue, there are some rules. A fugue in the classical style, in the style of Bach, there are some rules that you have to define given the initial statement, which is the theme of the fugue, called the subject. According to this, there are some properties that evolve, and these properties can develop in a certain way and not in other ways, and you have to find them and so on. But the most important thing is the beginning of the book, and you see that in the element of programming. You don't see it very clearly, but I can say there are primitive expressions. So when I say a compositional primitive, I refer exactly to that, which represent the simplest entities the language is concerned with. And I say compositional primitive is the simplest entity or the single point with which the composer is starting to compose. Not as important if it is a single sound or a longer thing. And then there are means of combination by which compound elements are built from simpler ones. That's why you put together different elements. If you want in a classical music, different notes, you make a motif, different motif, you make a theme. And means of abstraction by which compound elements can be named and manipulated as units. I will get to the means of abstraction in a moment when I talk about my own, approach. Another book that was for me important of the time I was at MIT was The Society of Mind by Marvin Minsky. Now, of course, this book is obsolete because functional magnetic resonance has given views on the brain for neurologists that at that time did not exist. But the idea that a brain is a society of agents that interact with each other, I found it very, very interesting. And actually today, what you see in when you are analyzing the functions of the brain by looking at what groups of neurons are doing. If you look at the research of the Institut du Cerveau in Paris or of Antonio Damasio in San Diego, you will really see this very clearly. And the last interesting book that I could read is The Teaching of Thinking, because you realize that if you can teach thinking, then there is an abstraction about thinking, which can be taught. And I was interested in, of course, the immanent thinking of music. So let's hear a little bit longer this beginning of this piece, which is a piece I wrote in the 80s, so it's a very old piece. And from the point of view of the different elements that belong with each other, and try to understand what is the logic or what is the thought behind these simple things. I will play just a couple of minutes until we start like this and we arrive here to the same idea, a little bit, say, changed. So the same idea at the beginning with another flavor, because of course the thought has evolved and therefore repeating the same thing would not have been very logical from the point of view of the musical unfolding, of course. So if we get a bit further into that, we get into the hardcore presentation of today's musical elements. I call that stufato because in Italian a stufato is a meal that has to stay a long time. Stufato means I get bored. So but I'm eating vegano because it's not so undigestible. It's not so heavy. So how do like that? Now, if I look at the way I work, now of course I become personal, but every composer has his own way of work. My starting point, what excites me or excited me at that time was a kind of morphological gesture that looks like this. So this is my primitive. Now, how does it sound? That's one thing for me. Now, you can say it's divided into different parts, but that's one thing. Now, this is an instance, if I use object-oriented language, this is an instance, that's not the class that I'm going to use. If you look at the class, it looks like this. So that's a synthetic abstract version of that. There are three parts of this, although it is one unit, but it has three parts. There is a head, the beginning here. There are the middle part, and then a different part that I call a joint. A joint is like a pipe that you connect to the following material. So I cannot decide it at the moment because I have to know what is coming after that to decide where to attach this element to the next one. So if we look at that, here it is the way it works. You have yam papa, and actually you hear it quite well because the performer, who is Pierre-Laurent Aymar, knew about this this approach. And if you are not, if you're not conscious of that, you would play yam pa 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 pa. So you would connect the two parts here to this ascending motif. But he does it on purpose, yam pa 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 pa, to highlight that the two things are separated. He starts a bit later. So you see that knowing the approach can also make you choose the right interpretative elements. Now, the way to analyze it, I will talk about OIM later, is that I have, so the different parts here can have components. I call them components. So the head, the beginning part has an accent, has a repeated part, and the relation between the accent and the repeated parts. What is my particular, approach and my contribution to music theory from this point of view is that I haven't heard about that before, is that each of these components have a weight between 0 and 10 in this case, but it could have been arbitrary unit, and which corresponds to the compositional importance for the composer of that. So the head is the main element of that. So if you change things that have a smaller weight, then you don't change the identity, you don't change the nature of the element. But if you change what is important, then you don't hear it anymore. So this idea that components, sometimes we call them parameters, but I don't like the term parameter because it's too old-fashioned, too related to the music of the 50s, and it doesn't work anymore. And nowadays, I prefer the components, so the elements of this point. So, of course, I would say this is an abstraction, and this is the first element that we just had, and there are different instances of that. Like in a class, there are different objects that correspond to the same class, that have the same structure, but not exactly the same data. So I wrote down a little bit, the complete evolution of that. You see the head become more and more big and so on. So until at the end, it becomes a very small cell like that. So this is the evolution of this element in its 19 instances. If we put them into what I call the three-dimensional morphological time-space, time is here, frequency is more or less y, and the z is the different instances, you get the more or less, you don't hear the details, but you see very well how the different parts of the element evolve and deform and change during the different repetition. Notice that these repetitions don't follow each other. They may follow each other, but they follow different. How they follow each other, we will see in a moment. So I call this thing that I just presented you a musical information organism. I don't want to get into the detail of that. Organism comes from a book by Jacques Monod, Les hasards, la nécessité, Chance as Necessity, where he talks about the nature of living things, or living organisms in respect to crystals that have similar properties but are not alive. And I don't mean organisms meaning that like a pet. I mean organisms in this formal way that Jacques Monod introduced that. What is important for the composer is that you may see a material or an idea as something static. You have this, or as something dynamic, something that evolves in time. And I saw that in the morphological time space, there are two time evolutions. There is evolution of the element in itself as in its unfolding, and the evolution of the elements across the elements, the way they change. So just to see that you can relate that. So let me be again more concrete and more practical. In this piece that I just presented for you, this piano version of this piece, there are 5 main oems, A, B, C, D, E. I call them like this. This one, the first one that you already saw. These are the elements, the synthetic elements. The second is the third one is a repeated notes with a rallentando and a thinning up of the things. The third and fourth, and the X has 3 different families. Just to say, these are, let's say, the components, the formal components of the piece. Now, when they come together in classical music, you have normally several melodies or several rhythms at the same time. Sometimes in some systems, especially in contrapuntal music, you cannot put 2 things together as you wish, arbitrarily. There are some rules that control the way the superposition of the voices. Here it is the same. But of course with these elements. I had to define different kinds of rules to say what happens if I have this and this and this together. I can't have a hand with 25 fingers. So I have to find a way, and then this and this together or gives this solution in the score in itself. So you see the different colors show how they were displaced. Another point is called a parasitical reduction. Parasite is something that, in my own metaphor, of course, it's something that maintains the identity of the element, but it is attached to something else. So the B7, which is the blue part here, is attached to C4. Why is C4 more important? We will see it in a moment. Or I call a satellite reduction. A satellite is something that loses let's say, the properties or the identity of the element. It becomes a sort of satellites are sort of small appoggiatura, small complement to the main element, which is in this case the B14. So, but the repetition, you quite don't see it here. Now, when you put the elements together, you also say why one element comes and when should the next one come, right? These rules was called the macro world paradigm or the global writing technique, so global techniques to shape a form. So I want to show shortly the technique that I use, which I call distribution function, for this part of the piece that we're going to listen to in a moment. I have my 5 elements, A, B, C, D, E, and then the family of X, and they all have a repetition rate that changes. When it is high, that is the repetition rate, that is the degree of appearance is faster, it's closer to each other. When it is low, it is less close to each other. So you see that A starts at the beginning very close to each other, then B passes from a moment where it becomes closer, then C becomes closer, and so on. So there are all moments where in the process of this kind of piano solo moment, you hear more closely to each other one family and less closely the other family. I gave myself the trouble to measure that, and the Y points are the theoretical, let's say, result of this distribution function. The plus points are the way they really are because of sometimes they'll be moved, sometimes they cannot be summed together, but you see that basically the piece passes through concentration of the first element, then a concentration of the second element, that's the second element, a concentration of the third, and so on, then it goes up to the end. So you have different elements in a context which is anyway relatively complex. So I formalized all this in an article that I wrote in the 80s for a symposium on cognitive sciences. So if you want to know more about the underlying, say, models, they come from prototype theory from Eleanor Roche and other things, just say, if you wish, read the article. But because I want to talk more about music than about theory, let me play for you the beginning of this part that I just have been analyzed. You see the A is here. In the next time there is again A. You see at the beginning there is quite a lot of A. Then you get the B, and then the B becomes closer, and then a moment the B gets closer to each other, and until you get here more blue things. And then you get to the C. The C are C, the black one, C, and we will hear until here, where you have a concentration on these elements. So try to follow this time not how each event connects to each other, but how each organism, each form, each morphology connects to each other. And so on. So you see how you get, say, focused more or less onto one category of, and of course, morphology. And it's my role as a composer to make these morphologies different enough so that they don't mix each other when they get together, and at the same time not too contradictory, not to become a sort of pastiche of different kinds of styles or different kinds of things. So the coherence is, of course, my role, and this goes throughout the whole piece. Now, I want to introduce another, so actually to quote Marvin Minsky, this work of working with morphologies, for me, it's a kind of society where I have different elements on different, let's say, agents that connect to each other, and it's my, and then there is impossible to define aspect, which is, okay, how you shape the details of that. How do you decide at the moment to add a fermata, because you need to have a small rest, to add something. These are all local constraints that depend on that cannot be formalized, depends on your feeling, and then there is the feeling of the performer. In this piece, there was no tempo, so there is no rhythm in the meaning of pulsed rhythm, so there are different gestures, how you shape the gestures so that they still become understandable for the listeners. Now, I want to jump to another point, which is important, which is the idea of, I talked about what is form, because this is also something that is very much confused in composition. Now, the classical, before I can introduce a form, I have to specify a few elements that are important, that are, for composers are natural, and maybe for non-composers they may be less natural. We talk about materia, as the interplay between sound produced by a gesture, by an instrumental gesture. In the case of electronic music, which we will hear tonight, the gesture is implicit in the action of the composer or of the person who realized the sound. So there is still a gesture in electronic music, but it's of a different nature. Then we talk about material, matériaux in French, not matériel, as an idea, something that is or a bit more structured, which is, I would call, matter organized by some thought. Now, all the sounds are not material, as I said, and the duration of the material is more or less computed in seconds. The duration of a theme is in seconds, and The amount of materials used are 7 plus minus 2, which is the size of the short-term memory in famous Miller's paper. And then we talk about, of course, more complex things. The idea of musical information organs is my contribution. You don't find it in a standard thing. Although I did analyze some of the music of Bach, Beethoven, and so on from the point of view of this formalism. It brings the principles of cognition. What is cognition? Is when you recognize something, that is, you hear something and say, I already heard it. Or I know that it's the same thing, the quotation of the same idea. It's a quotation, it's just a repetition. Or it's the same idea, but it's not the same sound. It has varied a little bit, but it's the same idea. Like when you are using a synonym in a word, you say the same thing, but it's not the same sound. What it means to develop an idea, or to variate an idea. Variation is something that is not directional. A development is something that is more directional. That it goes in a certain direction, has a certain aim. A variation just turns around, it's kind of Brownian motion around the theme, and so on and so on. The form, however, is what I call material organized by some thought, musical thought, immanent thought. The duration is rather in minutes. The size of a piece, there are very few pieces that are longer than hours, and that is, it addresses itself to the long-term memory. And then there is a very famous aspect that Stephen McCallum's analyzed in a paper that I found interesting, that sometimes you hear something and say, I know it, but I don't know what it is. I don't remember the name. Yes, I know it. I know it's on the tip of my tongue, but I don't know it. So you either identify something, but you did not recognize it. I mean, you could not name it, but you recognize it. You say, but that's it, not that. So this idea that you can identify something but not recognize it is a typical formal issue. And then when you comprehend it, you understand it, and then you understand the logic behind that. Now, in classical music, form is very ambiguous. Typically, there are constructing principles of historically defined elements, the sonata, the fugue, the sonnet, the haiku, still life, a portrait, and so on. I mean, they are formal principles. You can also talk about form as the external envelope, what I call the phenotype. For example, you look at this, you can say, I look at all of this, it's about 5 minutes of music, and this is the global form. I don't know what it is, but I mean, it goes here, it goes up, and I can draw an envelope, a line around that with more or less detailed, and then I can say this is a form of the external envelope of the piece, or you can analyze the sketches of the composer and get the hidden structure that normally is not accessible unless you are familiar with the style and or you have access to the sketches of the composer if the style is not familiar. However, for me, the form is what I call the evolution of dynamic states of the sensory of cognitive systems. I will say that in a moment. I will show that in a moment what they mean. With a very simple example. I'm taking an example from a set of pieces for piano that I wrote. I use piano because it's easier to understand, although I could have used other things. And I will concentrate on two. One is called Moai and one is called Nina Nana, Lullaby. And the compositional challenge of this piece is that you have a piece that has its own form. I mean, according to whatever it is, we will see that in a moment. However, there are in the form small elements that don't quite belong to the logic of the piece. Let's say you would call that ornamental elements, things that are just there to create something interesting, like an ornament in architecture or in painting. It doesn't bring the structure, but it makes the structure sometimes more interesting. For example, here is the beginning of a piece called Nina Nana, and we will play that at the beginning. And Nina Nana is, a lullaby. That's a movement that normally moves like that. And I play with this idea of moving. You see it here. That's the movement. Tam, 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 tam. Very slowly. It actually takes about 3 seconds to go from this and there because it will accelerate later. And there is a second, let's say, textural lulling movement. If you start to do like this, and then you accelerate it, and you accelerate until you do like this, you don't see it anymore, and this is a tremolo here, which is another way of alternating. We saw you hear a kind of texture, but the texture is made by an accelerated movement. In this thing here, there are there is at a certain moment a very strange thing that you would not really associate to a lullaby, something that puts you to sleep. Okay, that's part of the piece. Now we will see that the is an element that in the piece will be developed. That is, it appears again, it changes and it moves. We will hear the beginning of that. But this, no, it's just there, appears once, goes away, doesn't come back. Let's hear the beginning of that just to have a feeling of what it sounds like. That's a very slow movement, right? Bye-bye. And so on. So you see how the logic of this piece it is. You start with this very soft moment of bursting, of oscillation, and then you have this burst of energy that become larger and larger, and until the end of the piece. But this very clear doesn't come back anymore. So you say, what is the purpose of that? And the whole piece works in I would say in this way. It continues and goes on. I want to show you another point, however, which is important for me, which is this element here, this ornamental element, actually comes back in other forms, not quoted, so it's not a quotation, but it's the same idea, comes back in other pieces. And of these elements that come back in other pieces of different kinds, there are many, I mean tenths in this cycle, several tenths, more or less big. It can be a single note, can be can be this, which is a bit more, a bit more invading. It can be a simple gesture, something, a chord or whatever it is. There are different degrees of, elements that in the form of the piece don't have a real meaning, according to me, but they have a meaning if you say, but this element reminds me that other element, the way it goes like that and so on. This idea that you connect elements in different pieces is what I called a cognitive form, because it's a form that doesn't exist in the piece. It only exists in your mind by the action of identifying, maybe not recognize, but at least identify the different elements that come back in the different pieces. And I want to show you a couple of examples of this form, because it's something that I used, I'd say, consciously in this piece. So I go back to do this element at the beginning. So remember this. Right? Now, this element here finds the same in another piece, in another called prologos. It finds another aspect where the is a little bit more elaborated, and then the repetition is the same note, but it is faster. Also diminuendo, but it remains dry. And so on. It gives rise to another episode, another section, which is more mechanic, more, say, drier, more made of attacks. Now, if we separate the prrr from pa 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 pa, or we keep only that, right? You may say, what is the relationship between this and this excerpt of an orchestral piece that I will talk about in a moment? You might have noticed that there is some similarity. Now let's approach this similarity step by step. If you transpose this element, I did it on the sound, so the quality is not great. If I had a piano, I would do it on the piano. But if you transpose this element 1 octave higher, you have this. And then you slow it down by 2.33 times. You have this. You make it pianissimo. And then you get to this element that and so on. So you see how this thought has developed. Then there is a subtlety, an instrumental subtlety. A piano is very stable in the pitch, and therefore you always give the same pitch if you repeat the same note, unless you hit so strongly that you detune the pitch, but it's not wished, I would say, by the piano and by the piano tuners, and sometimes by the pianists and composers as well. Here, there are 3 Anglock. They are cloche-à-vache. They are percussive instruments that are tuned to this pitch. But the characteristic of that, they are not very, very well tuned. And you hear that boom, 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 boom. They're not perfectly the same thing. And actually, they're on 3 different parts. So you also hear that it moves like this in the orchestral part. So here is the same idea, the same element, in a completely different situation, which is the situation of an orchestral piece. This situation brings other elements. For example, the same idea, but you take away the pitch. You go back to the original speed, but you take away the pitch, you keep just the impulses. Always in the orchestral piece. Etc. So if I had told you what is the relation between this moment and the original example, I would say, yeah, there is a pulse. I mean, there is so much music that has a constant pulse that, I mean, it's very general what I would have said. But by showing the way the musical thought goes from the starting point, the piano, to this element, I think I could show the proximities of that. And to go back to say, how do I get to this? How do I get to this point? Well, in this element, I I became aware for this orchestral piece when I was asked to read orchestral piece. I became aware of this idea of cognitive forms. And I say in the piano pieces, and I say, okay, I want to orchestrate not a piano piece, but I want to orchestrate a possibly invented, imaginary cognitive form by using a moment of one moment, or the second, an orchestration of one element. I arrive to one of these points that are connecting the piece to the other pieces. I call this a structural bridge or a cognitive pointer. And then I go to the other piece, and then I move it there, and then I go back. So you see, I am just playing, I mean, artificially, because I composed this with this in the orchestral piece. And I want to show you just the beginning of this, the first 2-3 minutes of that, to have an idea of what it means to play in this way, to have a larger context than the simple expert that I show you. And then I go back to the color of the Nina Nanna, of the verses. So I propose that I show you the beginning, the piano piece that is the starting point. So you have the piano piece called Moai. Moai, they are the statues of Easter Island. They are very impressive wooden stone statues, and you see the stone in the element here. It's a little bit more worked out, and then there are filled up. And these accents, very strong accents. When you hear the piano part, they are very abrupt. They are very abrupt. When you hear the orchestra, they are a bit more worked out. So that maybe at the beginning is like this, but maybe this part here it becomes more worked out in a different way. And then I propose to play for you the beginning of the piano piece, just the first 2 pages until here, and then the equivalent version of the orchestral piece. And then you will hear that after this, we will move into this pum, 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 pum that we just heard. So we move away from this piece, so we get into this middle part of the Nina Nanna, just to have an idea of how the music, let's say, lives, I would say, and. So here is the beginning of, you see in the phenotype, I mean, the outline, the big blocks, you see them here, it's very clear. Also, when you look at the condensed sound of the piece. So here is the piano version, and I will, without interruption, I will move to the orchestral version. And here, choose. I go away. So I travel into this no man's land. And I land here where we had just heard. But this time, the pa-pa-pa-pa will be developed to become something important, not just an ornament. Until it is over-flooded by this group of chords, and it becomes different, and so on. And this is a whole piece. It's long, so I'm not going to play all of it. But you see how the musical thought has evolved, starting from a piano, moving to another through one of these cognitive pointer of structural bridges. I want to in this orchestral piece, I want just to give you another couple of elements of cognitive pointers that you will get. You remember the beginning of the lullaby, this color, right? Quite typical. I like it very much personally. I like this. It's very soft at the same time tender, but it has a fabric and so on. In this orchestral piece, in 2 moments, I get back to this color of the beginning. So, and here are the 2 elements in the piece where I get back to this point. It's actually the end of the first movement, so if you want to know how to get to it, you have to listen to the whole piece. And the last example, again in the second movement of the orchestral piece, another aspect, another perspective of the same color at the beginning of the lullaby. And so on. I would like to end here because my time has expired. But just I want to summarize the points is I try to show a way of thinking, I hope, that has a certain logic, if not a certain intelligence, and a certain coherence, like any thought, or sometimes incoherence. But this way of thinking is expressing with the sound, and I try to, with my words and especially with the examples, to show how the sounds can carry, so the music can carry this immanent way of thinking. Now what, I reduce myself to the piano because it's easier to look at the score and listen to, but this can be found in every other pieces. If you are interested in how to apply this, way of thinking to electronic music, well then come tonight and you will have the electronic version as a dessert for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and if there are questions or remarks, protests are welcome, and you're more than welcome. Thank you.
Perhaps there are some questions. Yes, so we start here.
Yeah. Are there examples of, let's say, contemporary compositions, atonali, with a musical thought that evolved towards, Baroque type compositions?
Yes, there are many composers. Actually, there is a so-called postmodern music that started in the 70s. Where the idea is to get, is a kind of collage that you get into different, you get from different parts of the existing music. Well, the point is, the problem with this is that these elements are so clearly understood, they're so strongly identifiable that they are like black holes. That is, if you get too close to them, then you can't escape anymore. And then you suddenly get into, even if you are a little bit so deforming the material to give the impression that will slowly you get into the Baroque, is hard. Because either you are too far and you don't hear it, or you are so close that it's up already. And when what is interesting is the approach of it, of course, because Baroque music is Baroque music, and say non-Baroque music or non-tonal music is another kind of things. And Berio was very good. Berio, for example, it was not in Baroque music, but in a movement of Sinfonia, the second movement of Sinfonia, he's taking music from romantic music, from Mahler, from Schoenberg, from Stravinsky, so not Baroque music, but still classical music, clearly. And then he's making a whole collage with 8 voices, a whole collage out of that, navigating in and out of that in a way that is, for me, is an absolute masterpiece, this movement. And then you hear the scherzo of the second symphony of Mahler, which is a very famous piece. And then you hear how Berio made of it, what Berio quoted of it, how he gets away of that. He makes an interpolation to Stravinsky, the end of the Rite of Spring, with some elements of something saying satellites coming from Ravel, coming from Schoenberg. That's really a masterpiece, but very few composers manage to get this level of, say, compositional proficiency.
I think Charino has done also some things to twist, no?
Yeah, I'm not so well, according to me.
Not so well.
No, not so efficiently. But, I mean, it's a personal point of view, of course.
Yes. I would like to come back to the parallel you made between composing and programming Andersen. One thing we want to achieve when we develop some scientific code is to ensure at one time the reproducibility of the results across hardwares and across compilers and etc. And is there any something like that? Do you expect your work to be reproducible, the result of your work to be reproducible, or do you want that to not be so reproducible, or how do you deal with the notion of reproducibility in your work?
Well, you can say I have the same idea or the same problem or the same approach, but I compile it, in quotes, for different sets of instruments. So I have a piano on one side, I have an orchestra on the other side, I have an ensemble, I have a string quartet, I have a violin, and so on. Each of these elements bring their own properties that are not only technical constraints, but also historical backgrounds. If you write a string quartet, you have 200 years of string quartets. If you write I don't know, a piece for 4 instruments that are not a string quartet, you don't have this historical background. So music is also a matter of history and weight of history. And even in electronic music, even if the history is shorter. So I would say that would be something like, and then while understanding that it is the same idea, that is the same musical process. Berio again did something interesting. He wrote a sequence of pieces for solo instruments. One piece for one instrument, a sequence. There are 14, I think, called sequenza or sequences. And then he wrote a version of the sequenza where he took the solo part and he amplified it with an ensemble. So he turned the solo part into a kind of concerto. He called a schema or path. And then in one case, I think the one for violin, if I don't make a mistake, he took away the soloist and he kept the background as a foreground. So he put the accompaniment, I mean the ensemble accompaniment, the soloist, as a foreground. And this idea is for me, again, an idea of saying, it's the same idea, it's the same music, it's the same unfolding, it's the same material, the same notes, the same chords, the same idea. But for 3 different, how to say, setups or 4 different hardwares. If you allow me to associate an instrumentalist to a hardware, which is, of course, not really completely correct, but still. But for me, the intellectual property of programming, at least the way it me, what I like in programming, we discussed with Jean-Louis often, what I like in programming is the idea that you are free to invent your own world, even non-Newtonian world, and your world that has nothing to do with the real world. It's a totally imaginary world that you can program it in the computer. And this world can represent what you thought. And how you develop your own things, whether it is for instrumental music, in which case when you compile it, you have to add the constraints of instrumental, let's say, instruments, or if you're doing with electronic music, then there are no limits, and then the limits is your human brain, limits of audibility, limits of perception, limit of discrimination, because it may be too complex that you hear nothing, you cannot discriminate the things. But there could be an interest in not discriminating things, or having something that is separated, get into the kind of texture, the kind of cloud of things that you don't understand anymore, But at the same moment, you listen to it with a global properties, with something that moves in a certain way as a texture. And this is for me when I was taking this course at MIT, it was very clear that Mr. Sussman, who knew nothing about music, but was talking to me about music. And although he didn't know about that, I mean, I talked to him and I said, look, you really taught me how to compose. And he said, oh, really? Interesting. And Marvin Minsky was already a musician, so he would play piano on his Kurzweil synthesizer, and he would already like to play with automatic accompaniment and so on. So he was more close to music. And his daughter was his student with me at MIT when I was studying there in the 80s.
So then we have to stop here. I just want to mention that you have seen the book Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programming, but the same authors has made Structure and Interpretation of Classical Mechanics, where he use computers not to understand the computers, but to understand mechanics, Hamiltonian, celestial mechanics. And it's very curious and very interesting. And we have to stop now if we want to go to the museum. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.